Soon after, the last family left. Not together, not dramatically. Just one morning when no smoke rose, no doors opened, and the wind moved freely through empty frames. The boy was gone too. No one knows when or how, and there was no one left to ask. They said the mountains were empty, and once something is written that way, it becomes easier to stop looking for people who still live there, long before borders were drawn with rulers and ink. The mountains already had names for themselves, names passed from mouth to mouth because paper never climbed this high. Villages existed where the wind learned human voices and paths were shaped by bare feet, long before machines arrived. Mornings began with smoke, rising from stone homes, and nights ended with prayers whispered into cold air. Life was slow, but it was real, and it did not ask to be remembered, only to be left alone. Then the road stopped. Not suddenly, not loudly, just quietly unfinished, like a sentence abandoned halfway. Engineers marked the region as difficult. Budgets were redirected, priorities shifted, and the line where asphalt should have continued simply ended. Beyond it were people who no longer mattered enough to reach. Maps were redrawn. On the new maps, the mountains became blank space, not because nothing was there, but because blank was easier to manage than responsibility. Officials circled the area and labeled it uninhabited, and with one word, entire lives slipped out of existence. The people didn't disappear that day. They woke up, cooked food, sent children to paths that once led to schools, waited for supplies that had been approved months ago. Nothing felt different at first. Abandonment rarely announces itself. It just delays help until help becomes a memory. Winter arrived earlier that year. It always did in the mountains. But this time it stayed longer. Snow closed the narrow trails, radios failed. Trucks stopped coming altogether. Families burned furniture to stay warm, and still no one came, because no one was officially there. Children learned the rules quickly. Do not expect rescue. Do not cry too loudly. Do not waste food. They learned that survival was not heroic. It was quiet and constant. It was carrying water uphill, burying the dead before the ground froze completely, and pretending hunger was normal. When the first elder died, the family sent word down the mountain. No response came back. When the second died, they didn't send anyone. By the third, they understood that death above a certain altitude no longer counted. Graves were dug where the earth allowed it. Stones placed instead of markers. Names spoken instead of written, because writing required someone, somewhere to read. The mountains watched without judgment. They had seen empires rise and fall. They would outlast neglect too. A teacher stayed longer than expected. She had been sent for a short assignment and forgotten like everyone else. Her salary stopped, then the letters stopped. But she stayed because leaving meant choosing which children deserved education and which didn't. So she taught without books, used stories instead of chalk, taught children their names carefully, as if names themselves were a form of resistance. When she finally left years later, the school closed forever. Children grew older without realizing it. They did not mark birthdays, because time mattered less when the future had already stopped arriving. Some never learned how old they were, only how cold it could get and how long hunger lasted. Officials wrote reports from offices far below. Population decreasing. Cause migration. Migration was cleaner than starvation. Migration did not require investigation. Migration closed files neatly, but no one had migrated. They had stayed, endured, disappeared slowly, the way mountains erase footprints overnight. One boy began writing names in a notebook. He wrote everyone he knew, neighbors, friends, people who had died, people who had gone quiet. He believed that if the names existed somewhere, then the people did too. Each page filled faster than the last, And when the notebook ended, so did the village. No one found the notebook. No one looked. Years later, satellites would pass overhead. They would see empty land and confirm the lie that had started it all. They would never zoom in close enough to see collapsed homes beneath snow, or the way paths still curved where feet once walked every day. The mountain stayed silent. Silence is what abandonment sounds like when it lasts long enough. When spring finally arrived, it did not bring relief. It only revealed what winter had finished quietly. Snow melted back into the ground like it was ashamed of what it had covered. Roofs collapsed inward where firewood had run out. Doorways opened to rooms that no longer smelled of people, and the paths between houses grew thinner because fewer feet remembered how to use them. The mountains looked the same from far away, but up close they were hollowed by absence. Down below, offices reopened their windows. Clerks returned to desks. Stamps were pressed, papers were signed, and somewhere between coffee breaks and meetings, someone noticed that an entire region had not submitted updates. So they did what systems always do when silence becomes inconvenient. They assumed movement. They wrote migration. Migration meant choice. Migration meant intention. Migration meant no one was at fault. No one climbed the mountain to check. The villagers felt the change before they understood it. Food deliveries that were once late stopped appearing altogether. Medicine lists were approved but never shipped. Letters sent downhill came back unopened or not at all. And slowly the people learned a new truth. Once you are marked as gone, the living version of you becomes irrelevant. Children stopped waiting for teachers. They still gathered in the old schoolhouse, not because lessons continued, but because habit is hard to kill. They repeated stories they remembered, traced letters in dirt, and corrected each other gently, as if education itself might hear them and return. It didn't. Parents stopped promising things they could not deliver. Promises make hunger louder. Instead, they taught practical lessons: how to read clouds, how to ration grain, how to recognize the sound of illness before it showed on skin. Childhood shortened without ceremony. One night a man tried to leave. He believed that if he walked long enough, he would reach help. He packed light, kissed his sleeping children, and stepped onto a path that winter had softened into mud. The mountain accepted him immediately. Fog swallowed his outline, and by morning, there was no sign he had ever tried. The villagers did not search. Searching requires hope. Officials updated the files again. Population further decreased. Cause: continued migration. No one questioned why migration only went one way. The mountains began to feel crowded with memories. Every abandoned house held voices that did not echo anymore. Every closed door became a marker of time stopping. And yet, the people who remained still woke up every morning, still cooked, still buried their dead. Because survival does not need permission. A woman began keeping track of births, not on paper but in knots tied into a rope. One knot for every child born since the world stopped counting them. The rope grew slowly, but it grew, and she hid it carefully because proof was dangerous if discovered too late. Some children were born without ever being officially alive. No records, no names beyond family. No future beyond altitude. They learned to stay quiet when strangers appeared. Strangers were rare, but when they came, they carried cameras or curiosity, never solutions. They asked how people lived up here, took pictures of resilience, and left with stories that made the suffering sound beautiful. The villagers learned to smile for visitors. Smiling ends conversations faster. Years passed unevenly. Some seasons felt endless, others vanished unnoticed. Children became adults without ceremonies. Adults became elders without acknowledgement, and the mountains absorbed each transformation without comment. Below, another report was finalized. The region was now officially empty. The line was drawn cleanly this time. No further resources required. No monitoring necessary. The mountains did not protest. They had already learned that forgetting is louder than any avalanche. And high above, where roads never reached and paperwork never climbed, people continued living in a place that no longer existed anywhere else. Children were born closer to clouds than to governments, and from their first breath they understood that the world below did not know their names. There were no hospitals here, only rooms cleared quickly and hands that had learned what to do by watching others survive. Births were quiet, not because pain was absent, but because noise felt wasteful in a place where help never came. Newborns were wrapped in whatever warmth existed, and their first lullabies were the sound of wind pressing against stone. No one wrote their births down. Paper did not last long in the mountains, and neither did promises. Some children grew without ever being recorded anywhere, meaning they had entered life already unprotected, invisible to systems designed to save only those who could be counted. They learned early that identity was fragile. A child without papers could not leave. A child without papers could not return. A child without papers could disappear without explanation. Education became something passed by voice. Elders taught children how to remember instead of how to read. Stories replaced textbooks, and history became something you carried inside because no one else would store it for you. Children memorized family names, not for pride, but for fear that forgetting them would make them vanish faster. Hunger shaped their days more than clocks ever did. Meals were measured not by time, but by availability. Children learned to chew slowly, to pretend fullness, to lie kindly so younger siblings could eat more. Survival rewired love into sacrifice. Illness arrived quietly. Coughs lasted too long. Fevers burned unchecked. Infections that would have been minor elsewhere became endings here. When a child died, the family grieved briefly. Extended grief was dangerous. The ground was frozen too often to allow ceremony. Graves were shallow, marked by memory instead of stone. Names were spoken softly and repeatedly so they would not fade too quickly. Officials far below continued updating files. Birth rate, 0. Child population, non-existent. The children who were alive were already erased. Some children asked about the world beyond the peaks. Adults answered carefully. They described cities that did not need courage to survive, schools that did not close forever, hospitals that arrived before it was too late. But they did not describe hope. Because hope made children want to leave, and leaving required papers. A boy learned how to watch the sky. He could tell weather hours before it arrived. Learned to read the mountains the way others read books. And he taught the younger children. Not because knowledge was power, but because power was survival. A girl learned to keep quiet. She noticed that quiet children lived longer, attracted less attention, used fewer resources, and asked fewer questions that adults could not answer. Her silence became a skill, and skills were currency. The village aged unevenly. Children carried adult responsibilities early, and adults shrank under the weight of failure they could not correct. Time stretched and folded unpredictably. Childhood disappeared without warning. No rescue came. No inquiry followed. No one asked why birth records were empty. Because empty records are easier to manage than abandoned children. Above the clouds, children continued growing in a place the world had already decided did not exist, and the mountains kept their secret without judgment, without mercy. Winter did not arrive suddenly, it crept in slowly, teaching the mountains how to erase people without being noticed. The first snow was always welcomed. Children ran through it. Elders measured it with memory. But as weeks passed and the sky refused to clear, snow stopped being beautiful and became weight. Roofs bent, doors froze shut, and the ground hardened into something that resisted even grief. Names began to disappear before bodies did. Illness spread quietly, carried by cold air and exhaustion. Fevers lingered because there was nothing to break them. Coughs echoed through homes that grew quieter each night. The old were taken first, then the sick, then those who were simply too tired to keep fighting altitude and hunger at the same time. Graves became difficult. Frozen earth does not accept shovels easily. Families waited for small windows of thaw, and when none came, they placed stones instead, stacked carefully, memorized by placement, because writing names felt useless when no one outside would ever read them. Children were taught where not to step. They learned which mounds were memories. Officials recorded nothing. Deaths without records are not deaths to a system. They are anomalies, and anomalies are ignored until they stop appearing. Winter solved that problem efficiently. Entire families vanished between seasons. When spring returned, there were homes no one opened, fires no one lit, paths no one cleared. The mountains looked unchanged, but the silence deepened in places where laughter had once bounced between walls. People learned to stop asking who was next. That question required time. Time was already running out. A woman memorized every name she buried. She repeated them each night before sleeping, afraid that forgetting even one would make that person disappear completely. Her memory became a graveyard, and it grew heavier each winter. Children stopped crying at funerals. Crying used energy, and energy was rationed carefully. Grief became internal, quieter, sharper. It aged them faster than hunger ever could. Down below, reports were finalized. Seasonal mortality unverified. Cause environmental conditions. No investigation followed. Environmental conditions are not crimes. The mountains held the weight of uncounted dead without complaint. Snow fell again, softer this time, covering markers, smoothing ground, erasing even the small signs that someone had been there. Graves disappeared into terrain, and memory became the only proof left. By the time the cold retreated, the village had lost more names than homes. And when the names fade, history does not chase them. It lets them go. When the numbers finally reached the desks below, they were already clean enough to accept without questions. A region once marked as declining was now marked as resolved. And resolution is what happens when a problem stops demanding attention. Officials leaned back in their chairs and agreed on the simplest explanation. Migration. The word fit perfectly because it required no witnesses, no graves, no follow-up. Migration sounded voluntary, almost hopeful, as if people had chosen better lives instead of being slowly erased by altitude and neglect. Files were updated carefully. Villages listed as relocated. Population transferred. Resources no longer required. No one asked where the people had gone. Up in the mountains, the word migration had never been spoken. People did not leave in groups. They did not pack belongings or say goodbyes. They vanished one by one, quietly, unevenly, the way candles go out when there is not enough air. Some tried to walk down. They left early, carrying only what they could manage, believing that if they reached the road, everything else would return. But paths shifted, weather turned, and the mountain has a way of deciding who is allowed to pass. Most never returned, and no one knew if they had reached help or simply become part of the landscape. Their absence was recorded as success. Those who remained learned to stay still. Movement attracted attention, and attention invited questions they could not answer. So life slowed even further, days blended together, and survival became routine rather than struggle, a dangerous stage where loss stops shocking and starts feeling expected. Children stopped asking why no one came. They asked instead how long things would last. Adults stopped answering altogether. A man found old documents buried in a collapsed house. Faded papers with stamps and signatures from a time when the villages were visible. He brought them out like proof of existence, believing that if someone below saw them, help might return. But the papers were outdated, irrelevant. The system had already moved on. Outdated proof does not reopen closed files. Homes began collapsing on their own. Without maintenance, stone cracked, wood rotted, and entire structures folded into themselves. The mountains reclaimed what humans had built slowly, and no one stopped it. Rebuilding required belief in a future, and belief had become expensive. One family stayed longer than they should have. They believed endurance was loyalty, that staying meant honoring those who had already died there. But endurance without support is just delayed disappearance. And one winter, they did not wake up. Their home stood empty when the snow melted. Below, the word migration was used again. Migration explained why schools had no students. Migration explained why clinics had no patients. Migration explained silence. It explained everything without explaining anything. Maps were finalized. Blank space replaced villages. Tourism brochures would later describe the area as untouched, pristine, natural. They would celebrate its isolation without knowing isolation had been enforced, not chosen. The mountains did not correct the story. They never do. And so the people who had lived and died above the clouds became a footnote written in pencil, easy to erase, already fading, while the world below congratulated itself for closing another file cleanly. The boy found the notebook in a house that had collapsed inward, its roof surrendering quietly during a winter no one officially remembered. It was small, thin, and already half-used. The kind of thing that once held school lessons before schools stopped existing. The pages smelled of damp and dust, but they were still blank enough to matter. And the boy understood immediately that empty pages were dangerous. In a place where emptiness spread faster than snow, he began with names. Not lists, not categories, just names written carefully, slowly, as if each letter needed permission to exist. He wrote his parents first, then his siblings, then neighbors, then people who no longer answered when called. He did not cross anyone out when they died. Crossing out felt like agreeing with disappearance. The notebook became heavier with every page, not in weight but in responsibility. Every name written meant someone remembered, and remembering had become an act of defiance. The boy hid the notebook under his clothes, carried it when he moved, slept with it nearby, because losing it would mean losing everyone twice. Adults noticed but did not stop him. Stopping him would have meant admitting that memory was all they had left. The boy wrote names he had only heard once, visitors who never returned, children who died too young to be recorded, elders whose stories ended mid-sentence. He asked questions before writing. How do you spell it? Who were their parents? Where did they live? When no one knew, he wrote the name anyway. Imperfect memory was better than none. Seasons passed unevenly. The notebook filled faster as the village shrank, each winter adding more names than births ever did. The boy learned to write smaller, tighter, conserving space the way others conserved food. Margins disappeared, lines blurred. Handwriting changed as his hands grew older than his age. One day a stranger arrived. Not to help, not to stay, just passing through with a camera and curiosity. The stranger asked questions, took pictures of ruins, called the place tragic and beautiful in the same sentence. The boy showed him the notebook without fully understanding why. The stranger glanced at it briefly. Too briefly. He nodded, said it was sad, and moved on. Sad did not reopen roads. Sad did not bring medicine. Sad did not save anyone. The boy stopped showing the notebook after that. Some names stopped being spoken aloud. There was no one left who remembered how. The notebook reached its final page quietly. No announcement, no warning, The boy stared at the empty space and understood what it meant. When there was no more room to write names, there was no more room for the village to exist. He closed the notebook carefully, as if noise might undo what little remained. Soon after, the last family left. Not together, not dramatically. Just one morning when no smoke rose, no doors opened, and the wind moved freely through empty frames. The boy was gone too. No one knows when or how, and there was no one left to ask. Below, the files were updated one last time. Population 0. Status abandoned. The notebook was never found. If it was buried, it rests somewhere under stone and snow. If it was burned, it warmed someone briefly before becoming ash. If it was carried away, it no longer has a reader. Without the notebook, the names lost their last witness. And so the village ended the way it had been prepared to end all along. Not with violence, not with alarms, but with paperwork completed and silence approved. The mountains remained. They always do. Silence settled after the last footsteps faded. Not suddenly, but carefully, like something placing itself where it knew no one would resist. The mountains did not feel empty at first. They felt paused. Doors still stood. Paths still curved where people had walked for generations, but without voices to press against the air. Everything sounded unfinished, as if the land itself was waiting for someone to return and explain what had happened. No one did. Wind moved freely now, entering homes without asking, lifting curtains that no longer belonged to anyone, rattling utensils left behind because carrying them felt pointless at the end. The mountains learned every sound by heart because there were no new ones coming. Below, life continued normally. News cycles changed. Budgets shifted. Attention moved elsewhere. Silence above did not register as urgency. It registered as success. Quiet meant stability. Quiet meant nothing was wrong anymore. Quiet meant no complaints were being filed. No one investigates silence. Animals returned first. They moved through doorways without fear, nested where children once slept, chewed through what remained of furniture. Nature is efficient when reclaiming spaces left unattended. It does not ask why people left, only whether anything useful remains. Weather followed. Rain entered through broken roofs, froze, expanded cracks, accelerated decay. The mountains were not cruel. They were thorough. Erosion finished what neglect had started. Somewhere far below, new technology came online. Satellites began passing overhead more frequently, their lenses sharp, their data precise. They scanned the peaks and valleys, measuring elevation, vegetation, movement, and when they saw none, they confirmed the final assumption: uninhabited. The designation felt official this time. Digital confirmation carries authority paper never did. Once something is marked empty by machines, it becomes very difficult to argue that people were ever there at all. No human voices were captured, no lights detected at night, no heat signatures recorded. Graves do not register as movement. Collapsed homes look like rocks from above. The mountains passed every test for absence. A report was generated. The region was now classified as natural terrain, untouched, ideal for conservation. The irony was unintentional. Protection arrived only after the people were gone. Preservation followed erasure perfectly. Maps were updated again. Paths disappeared. Village names vanished. Only elevation numbers remained. Silence deepened. If someone had climbed the mountain then, they would have felt it immediately. Not emptiness, but density. The way places heavy with memory pressed back against the body. But no one climbed anymore. Curiosity does not travel uphill without invitation. The mountains held what they were given. They held voices in stone, footsteps in soil, names where no ink had survived. Silence became permanent, not because nothing had happened, but because everything had already been decided elsewhere. And so the mountains stood, fully visible to the world for the first time, while the people who once defined them became completely invisible. Years passed in a way that only forgotten places experience. Unevenly, without witnesses, without measurement, time continued because it always does. Not because anyone was counting anymore. High above, satellites continued their silent rotations, capturing images with perfect clarity, feeding data into systems that valued patterns over stories. Algorithms compared older images to newer ones and confirmed stability. No movement meant nothing was wrong. No change meant success. From this distance, absence looked clean. What the images did not show were the layers beneath. The collapsed rooms hidden under vegetation. The foundations still outlining where kitchens and beds once existed. The small clearings that marked graves too shallow to cast shadows. Technology does not recognize mourning. A proposal was drafted. The region was recommended for tourism, untouched wilderness, breathtaking views, rare silence. Brochures praised the isolation as purity, the lack of human presence as beauty. The narrative was rewritten so thoroughly that forgetting began to feel intentional. Soon the first visitors arrived. They came with backpacks and cameras, careful shoes and curiosity. They followed newly marked trails that avoided the ruins without realizing it, walked over places where people had once lived, slept and died, and felt peaceful because no one interrupted them. They photographed stone walls and called them ancient. They stood in empty door frames and called them mysterious. They admired the quiet and called it healing. No one asked why children's shoes were sometimes found buried near thresholds. Guides told safe stories. They spoke of long-lost settlements, of people who had moved on generations ago. They never mentioned how recently the smoke had stopped rising, how little time had passed between living villages and empty terrain. Truth makes vacations uncomfortable. The mountains did not correct them. They never do. Souvenirs were sold, postcards printed. Silence became a product. Some tourists felt uneasy but could not explain why. The air felt heavier in certain spots. Nights felt watched. But discomfort without explanation is easily dismissed as imagination. One visitor found a name scratched faintly into stone. He photographed it, posted it online, and forgot about it within days. The image blended into thousands of others. Context stripped away by scrolling. No investigation followed. No archive updated. Digital memory is short. Below, the final administrative step was completed. The region's past population was officially reclassified as historical, no longer requiring records or follow-up. The last opportunity to acknowledge loss passed quietly, like everything else. Above, the mountains held their position. They watched as people returned, not to live, but to consume the emptiness left behind. And in the silence between footsteps and camera clicks, the land remembered what the world chose not to. By the time the ruins became popular, they were no longer recognized as ruins. They were labeled sites, points on a map, stops on an itinerary, moments between meals. People arrived expecting history, something distant enough to admire without responsibility. They wanted stories with safe endings, tragedies already processed by time, not losses still warm beneath the soil. The mountains gave them none of that. Structures collapsed further each year, not from age but from attention. Hands touching what should have been left alone, feet pressing paths deeper into places never meant to be revisited, erosion accelerated by curiosity. Nothing disappears faster than something briefly remembered. A small plaque was installed near one trail. It spoke vaguely of former inhabitants, no dates, no names, no reasons, just enough acknowledgement to ease conscience without opening questions. The plaque weathered quickly. Unreadable within seasons, neglect returned as policy. Tour guides adjusted their language. They avoided words like abandoned and displaced. They preferred transitioned and relocated. Language softened loss until it sounded voluntary. Some visitors began collecting pieces. A stone, a rusted nail, a fragment of wood. Proof they had been there. Proof that something had existed. These fragments traveled far from the mountains, ending up on shelves and drawers. Stripped of meaning, grief dispersed into decor. Below, researchers proposed a study, not of people, of geology. The mountains were analyzed, drilled, measured, their value recalculated in terms of resources, not memory. What lay beneath became more important than what had been erased above. Approval was quick. Silence makes authorization easy. Heavy machinery never arrived. Not yet, but the decision was made. And decisions, once recorded, rarely reverse themselves. The mountains felt it then. Not anger, not fear, recognition. They had reached the final stage of forgetting when even absence becomes useful. If anyone had searched deeply enough, they would have found records that did not align, population numbers that dropped too fast, supply logs that ended abruptly, names that never appeared again elsewhere. But searching requires intent, and intent had long been redirected. The story was now complete enough for the world. An empty place, a beautiful place, a place that had moved on. Only the mountains remained unwilling to agree. They carried the weight of unfinished lives, of stories never closed, and as attention shifted once more, they prepared to keep remembering alone. In the end, nothing dramatic happened. No discovery forced the world to look back. No document surfaced to undo the erasure. No apology was issued. Forgetting does not announce itself. It settles. The mountains remained exactly where they had always been, unchanged enough to appear innocent, altered enough to hold everything that was no longer spoken. Snow still fell, rocks still fractured. Seasons continued their careful repetition. Below, life moved on with confidence. Children learned new maps in school, ones where the peaks were labeled but never explained. Teachers spoke of geography, not of lives. Absence had been normalized into curriculum. Archives closed files. Digital systems deleted what had not been accessed. Memory expired quietly. Above, the land carried what remained. Footsteps pressed into soil long after the feet were gone. Foundations resisted collapse longer than expected, not out of strength but insistence. Names once spoken daily lingered in the way wind curved around certain stones. The mountains did not mourn the way humans do. They did not cry. They did not demand justice. They remembered. They remembered because no one else would. When tourists stopped coming, when research budgets shifted, when attention finally moved to louder tragedies elsewhere, the peaks returned to silence. The kind that no longer waits to be filled. Nothing remained to interrupt it. From above, satellites still passed, confirming stability, absence preserved, nothing to report. The systems were satisfied. From below, there were no voices left to contradict them. What had happened would never be fully told. Not because it was unknown, but because it was inconvenient. The truth remained scattered across terrain, buried in patterns only patience could read, and patience belongs to mountains, not to men. So the world continued, confident in what it could see, unaware of what it had chosen not to ask, while the forgotten mountains stood, holding 10,000 unmarked endings beneath their silence, not lost, not erased, only remembered by the land that outlived them. The end.